I'm Teresa Coraggio, and this is Third Paradigm in a series called Yes and Russell Brand. Today, I'm responding to an old episode of Under the Skin, number 24, Inequality is Killing Us with Jason Hickel. I have so many things to say yes to with Jason. This is very exciting. And I have things to say and to that I hope he will be excited about. So we'll be talking today about the global migration of money, about GDP and the difference between wealth and money. We'll be talking about Name That Coup and the currency wars, and the dark side of spiritual oneness. Let's get started. The perspective that I'm going to take on inequality is killing us is inequality is killing them, but it's like a dementor that sucks our soul out through our eyeballs, but leaves the body intact to go to work another day. I'd like to quote from the economist Susan George when she looks at what it is that really is the wealth that creates this difference in money. This is from a 1976 book called How the Other Half Dies. The most pressing cause of the abject poverty which millions of people in the world endure is that a mere 2.5% of landowners with more than 100 hectares control nearly 3/4 of all the land in the world, with the top 0.23% controlling over half. So that was before Bill Gates and his massive land grab, along with others. So I'm certain that that has not gotten better. I quote that in my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, available on Amazon for lack of a better option. And I look at the difference between wealth and money. That wealth means the assets that back the money, and those give people control over their own lives. Every producer nation wants the assets. They want a redistribution of land. Every consumer society wants a redistribution of the money. Money gives you power over other people. It's a means of stealing the assets and then being able to control people in the interest of whoever's creating that money. I was listening this morning to Alan Watts talking about wealth and money, and he compares money to inches. It's a concept. And so what he says is you wouldn't say, oh, I can't have this because we have the means to build it, we have the resources, we have the labor, but we don't have the inches. I think that's a very astute point, and one that was also made by Benjamin Franklin at the origin of this country before it was the United States. And he invented a brilliant form of local currency that was developed with that same point in mind. But I think that Alan Watts is a little bit naive when he thinks that you can walk away from that without being subject to it. Because while inches may just be a concept, the people who hold hostage shelter, food, goods, services, that's not just an abstract concept. So it's as if we've taken something that was measured in inches and we changed the ruler so that now that house that cost so many inches a generation ago is now being measured in centimeters. So that holds all of us so that we can't afford our own labor, because they're still measuring our lives by a different ruler. So Jason talks about the capital flows and how money actually migrates from south to north, not the direction that we think it does, since we're getting all the goods and food and energy also. But what about the money? Why is that going in this direction? And in a documentary called The End of Poverty, ? Susan George also talks about that. She says, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the poorest part of the world, is paying $25,000 every minute to northern creditors. Well, you could build a lot of schools, a lot of hospitals. You could make a lot of job creation if you were using $25,000 a minute differently from debt repayment. So there's this drain, and I think people don't understand that it is actually the South that is financing the North to the tune of $200 billion every year. So one of the solutions that Jason looks at is debt cancellation, debt forgiveness, a debt jubilee. I think that's great, but it doesn't go far enough. When I was doing my radio show, Third Paradigm, a decade ago, I looked at Ecuador and how they were doing a reassessment of their debt. They were looking at what debt was extractive, what had been harmful, what was vulture debt that had been imposed. And so what they came up with at the time was that actually they were owed by the corporations for all the wealth that they had extracted without putting any real value in. Another thing that Jason talks about is trade system change. And he mentions how when you have a debt that's denominated in dollars, they can raise the interest rate as they did to 20% and completely wipe out that country and take all their assets. I think that all debt should always be denominated in the currency of the country borrowing, because that way it's as if you're pledging your future labor or future produce in return for that investment, which at that point really is an investment because it's going both ways. The currency is a really critical thing to be looking at and how that can be manipulated. I want to read from another book that I quote in my book, and this is called Little B by Chris Cleave. It's a work of fiction that is wonderful. It starts, "Most days I wish I was a British pound coin instead of an African girl. Everyone would be pleased to see me coming. Maybe I would visit with you for the weekend, and then suddenly, because I am fickle like that, I would visit with the man from the corner shop instead. But you would not be sad, because you would be eating a cinnamon bun or drinking a cold Coca-Cola from the can, and you would never think of me again. We would be happy, like lovers who met on holiday and forgot each other's names. A pound coin can go wherever it thinks it will be safest. It can cross deserts and oceans and leave the sound of gunfire and the bitter smell of burning thatch behind. Of course, a pound coin can be serious too. It can disguise itself as power or property, and there is nothing more serious when you are a girl who has neither. You must try to catch the pound and trap it in your pocket so that it cannot reach a safe country unless it takes you with it. But a pound has all the tricks of a sorcerer. When pursued, I have seen it shed its tail like a lizard so that you are left holding only pence. How I would love to be a British pound. A pound is free to travel to safety, and we are free to watch it go. This is the human triumph. This is called globalization. A girl like me gets stopped at immigration, but a pound can leap the turnstiles and dodge the tackles of those big men with their uniform caps and jump straight into a waiting airport taxi. Where to, sir? Western civilization, my good man, and make it snappy." I had the opportunity to meet Chris Cleave when he was doing a book reading for this book, and I mentioned to him that I thought there was an inverse relationship between the freedom of money and goods and food to cross borders and the ability of people, because what would be the point if the people could follow the money? And he was going to use that in the future, and I hope he does. I think I can safely say that I'm one of the few people who's actually read free trade agreements, which are not free, not trade, and not agreements. What they really are is 99 pages of investor protections in exchange for an occasional paragraph of here's what we're going to do for you. So in those, the speed of egress of money has been lubricated. That free trade really means tax-free trade. And even within that, there's all kinds of loopholes that I'll get into another time about how that gets siphoned off into tax havens. The exchange of goods, money, and services within a country is called the GDP, or gross domestic product, which Jason talks about. But it's actually, according to economist Michael Hudson, who writes about the FIRE economy, finance, insurance, and real estate, that all financial exchanges are actually 99.9% just money, just things like stocks, bonds, financial derivatives. Only 0.1% of the economic exchange is actually goods and services. I track the relationship between the GDP and the money supply from 1940 to 2014. And what I show is that money in the US barely changes hands 1.5 times in a year, which means that it's getting sucked out. And while the speed of exchange between countries, which only benefits large corporations, has been accelerated, it has been hampered and slowed down so that we're not really producing our own goods and services. And I was thrilled to hear Jason talk about coups and the currency wars and mention Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso. When my girls were little, during long car rides, we would play Name That Coup, where someone had to describe what had happened. Someone else would name the leader who was assassinated or deposed, and the other person would name the country. It was not easy being my daughter. I was somewhat vindicated, though, when Captain Fantastic came out with Viggo Mortensen. I really wish I had thought about having Noam Chomsky Day the way that he does in that. So, in my book, I have a chapter called Swept Away by the Currency, where I talk primarily about Libya and Gaddafi and what happened there that we never hear about. So here's something that I just can't believe that I didn't know this, that after World War II, France didn't have the money to militarily control all of their assets. And so they liberated them in exchange for 14 countries operating through the CFA franc. The CFA franc is controlled by France, and 85% of all foreign transactions go back to the Paris Bourse, to the Paris Treasury, where they can be invested at their own discretion without any transparency. And if that country, one of those 14 countries, wants to borrow back their own money, they can do it at interest if it doesn't exceed 20% of their own revenues. And so the exchange rate and that interest rate are both determined by the French government. Gaddafi was looking at creating, along with the Ivory Coast leader, Laurent Gbagbo, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry, creating the Pan-African dinar. And that would have been a currency that enabled intracontinental trade. In '69, Gaddafi had overthrown a corrupt regime and nationalized the oil revenue. And in Arab Spring, Libyan winter, Vijay Prashad writes, that money was then diverted towards social welfare, mainly an increase in housing and health care. First, nationalizing the oil companies, fixing a minimum wage, extending the welfare and health systems, and slashing the obscene rents being charged by property owners. A limit was imposed on the rents that landlords could charge, fixing maximum rents at about 1/3 of the pre-revolutionary level. When Gaddafi took power, the literacy rate in Libya was a miserable 20%. The consequence of the transfer payments lifted the rate to 90% by 1980. Aware of the hardships in the countryside, Gaddafi's regime allowed farmers to settle on confiscated Italian and Senussi land, and the government provided them with low-interest loans to buy farm equipment and inputs. Land could be purchased interest-free, and until the farm became self-sufficient, the farmer was eligible for a government salary. The regime constrained private enterprise and encouraged workers to take control of about 200 firms. The central bank redistributed wealth by putting a ceiling on bank account holdings. It was a straightforward redistribution of wealth conducted as a currency exchange. That might be as surprising to you as it was to me. So we've been told a different story about why these regime change activities have happened with the US and NATO and then the French government. And lastly, it did my heart good to hear Jason talking about the spiritual anxiety when we are causing misery. I think that that's the downside of this concept of spiritual oneness. If we're really one, we can't be doing things to other people without it having an impact on ourselves, whether we know about it or not. It used to be that I would talk about these things, which 20 years ago were not really well known. And people would feel like I was making them guilty because if they didn't know about it, they could eat that chocolate bar and be perfectly innocent. Feeling guilty makes no difference whatsoever to the person who makes a product. What really makes a difference is knowing and acknowledging that we have the power to change that. Thank you, Jason. This was a great episode. If you're intrigued and would like to go deeper into these ideas, here's another video on a related theme. And if you'd like to delve into this entire area, here's a playlist. Thank you, and I would love it if you would subscribe.